Jared McCann did get a goal for the Seattle Kraken the other day, but what are the things that the team is focused on with regard to Jared McCann, and could he be a player that we see moved at the trade deadline? Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, Seattle hockey fans? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we bring you your favorite team, the Seattle Kraken, every single day. You can also listen to Locked On Mariners. We've got Locked On Huskies. The women's basketball show, of course, covers the Seattle Storm and on and on. But today's episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So head over to FanDuel to check it out. All right, we're going to talk about Jared McCann. Jared McCann, Canner, the first Seattle Kraken player to get an extension. He scored in the most recent game against Florida. And, that was his first goal in quite some time over the season. Jared McCann is at in 60 games, 15 goals, 28 assists for 43 points overall. Now, Jared McCann has scored or tallied 50 or more points every season for the Seattle Kraken, 50 on the nose in 21-22. 70 points for the Seattle Kraken in 22-23 last year with 62 points. So fallen a little bit behind here with, roughly 20 games or so to go. And we would love to see more productivity from Jared McCann. And Dan Bylsma, head coach of the Seattle Kraken, as I'm sure you know, actually talked about McCann. Well, he was asked about McCann and talked about getting to see McCann get the game winner in Florida and then the two games against Tampa Bay and St. Louis, which he literally is just going to wash for a lot of reasons. But if you look at those three games coming in or coming out of the break, what Dan Bylsma wanted to see from Jared McCann, and we've talked about this, is something that he's wanted to see from Shane Wright, I think Matty Beniers, and the team as a whole, is the shot quantity. And so that's something good that we're seeing per Dan Bylsma, that the shot quality, the shot quantity is going up. But there has been a conversation about shot quality, but maybe not in the way that you think. Let's take you over to Dan Bylsma. This is from after yesterday's practice, talking about Jared McCann. We have a few more clips from yesterday because we're also going to talk about Shane Wright and Koko on today's episode. But let's talk about Jared McCann first. And what is his role on this team? And what will his role be perhaps come the trade deadline?
Well, I think, just the shot total coming out of the break, 5 in Florida and 5 in Tampa Bay. I haven't gotten to the number on the tape yet in St. Louis, but I'm not going to look there. But he's going to have the flank in the power play, the post in the power play, and I know there's 2 other shots 5-on-5 that he had as well. So I think just good to see him get a goal there, but better to see him underlining his game with being a pointed shot guy, not just a shot from distance, not just flippers on nets, where they're coming from, and the quality of those shots are huge indicators for his game.
So that's Dan Bylsma talking about Jared McCann. And you heard that, he's looking at, the 5 goals, the 5 shots on goal in the 2 Florida games, and he was pretty much right on target. Jared McCann did have 4 shots on goal in the game against St. Louis, no goals. And his time on ice in the last 5 games is kind of hovering between 16 and 17 minutes. So in that first clip, and we'll play another clip in a moment, in that first clip, it's about the good progression is not the goal itself. The good progression is that there are more shots that Jared McCann is taking. And the reason that Dan Bylsma thinks that that's important is because they've been focused a lot on the process, not just with McCann, but as we'll hear from him shortly, these are the specific conversations that Dan Bylsma and the coaching staff are having with Jared McCann. And that is to be less in love with the perfect shot. You'll also hear him talking about taking shots from distance, and be in love with the process, be in love with and understand the concept and the notion of what are we trying to do. And the reason that these conversations, Dan Bylsma goes on to say, I'm just going to, because there's a little bit of I cut the question out here, but I believe it was Jeff Baker says, how important is some of that process work with a player like Jared McCann, who's going to be really hard on himself? And he says, yeah, it's really important. So here's the continuation of Dan Bylsma speaking about Jared McCann and why it's so important to really focus in on what the ask is from the team so that Jared McCann can focus on the process, and the process will yield results.
You have to focus on the process, and you have to focus on the underlining details to what lead to goals. Not just hope for a goal to come by any specific way. And those are the things that we're, talking to Jared about. That's any goal score. It's an area that you can expand where you score, how you score, different ways you can score, and not just have it be one way.
And so there you go. It's also, again, not falling in love with a particular way to score, as we just heard. And all of these things I think are critical, because I've said on multiple occasions on this podcast that Jared McCann has gotten a little lost in the sauce when it comes to, it feels like on my eye test, it feels like he's gotten lost in the sauce with all of the different lines changing. And he's not glued to a line that's necessarily helping raise his game. He's more been a person that is on a line to maybe anchor and solidify players on the come up, and or because other combinations are perhaps meeting a little bit more success. So it's been a little bit rough because Jared McCann has to and is being asked to do exactly what we heard from Dan Bylsma, but also the team, I think, underlying is asking him to perhaps play a little bit of a different role in service of the longer term picture and goal. And I think some of that has to do with Matty Beniers, some of that has to do with Shane Wright. But what does that mean for Jared McCann? Well, I'd say in the last few weeks, the rumor mill regarding trades has been a flutter, and Jared McCann, alongside Jamie Alexiak, actually have been tied to the Winnipeg Jets, to the point where this is another article from The Athletic where actually readers sent in hypothetical trades. This one, Jamie Alexiak and Jared McCann to the Winnipeg Jets for Brad Lambert, a 2025 first-round pick, and Logan Stanley. And so what they do is they have a writer from The Athletic give their overview, and then anonymously 2 agents and an executive. So let's start with the executive. The executive says that could work out. A lot of moving parts, though, and every team values the players in this range differently. So that's kind of your entry level. What's really going on here is this good value. Agent B says, I would do then if I was Winnipeg. McCann has been one of Seattle's best players. Not a huge fan of either defenseman in the deal, but I know Stanley struggles. I like Alexiak more. Interesting. And then Agent A I think both teams agree. Maybe add a conditional third round pick or something to Seattle too. So that's what the agents, the anonymous agents, and one executive say. As far as the athletic staff, if I were Winnipeg, I would hold on to Lambert and the first round pick, but I could see the Jets making this trade. So if you're holding on to Lambert and the first round pick, that essentially means that you're willing to give up Logan Stanley for Jamie Alexiak and Jared McCann. This is what particularly is said about McCann. Over the past 3 years, McCann has scored more points per minute at 5-on-5 than any Jets forward outside of Nikolai Ethers. Lawton's scoring rate by comparison is closer to that of Adam Lowry and Mason Appleton. Lambert and Winnipeg's first round pick both have a lot of value, so there's substantial risk here. Still, McCann is 28 years old and has 2 seasons left on his contract after this one. I'm less worried about this trade than one that was mentioned higher up in the article. And then they talk about Jamie Alexiak. We're not going to talk about Jamie on this episode, but just something that I will definitely come back to before we hit the trade deadline. So getting Jared McCann going here, I think, is huge, and I want to see it. I could see, though, Jared McCann being a piece for the Seattle Kraken to perhaps dangle. And as we talked about on the last episode, whether that's for the trade deadline or getting those conversations in motion now to maybe have those conversations in the off season. But it all starts with Jared McCann and his mentality, and the Seattle Kraken are putting in time. The coaching staff is spending time with him. One way or another, Jared McCann will be a part of the Seattle Kraken's future, whether that means a key part, I should say, of his future, whether that means that he stays on the team. So putting in this work now, getting him confident, getting him comfortable, making sure that he's not putting that internal pressure on himself, but instead being able to broaden the scope a little bit as he sees the ice and not get committed to certain areas, but instead be a playmaker primarily for himself. And then, of course, for the team, that's going to be critical if he stays. If he doesn't stay, this work still is going to allow the Seattle Kraken to talk about the value that Jared McCann has. And I've mentioned it before. It's been mentioned in other trade rumor postings that, we were talking about Andre Burakovsky yesterday, but similarly, because of how the structure of the Seattle Kraken is right now, and I think McCann has been asked to be the odd man out in some of the line shifts, maybe a fresh look, a fresh start isn't the worst thing in the world. I asked a hypothetical question the other day. Does this team still believe in this franchise? I happen to strongly believe that Jared McCann is one of the players that does. So it would be sad to see him go. I personally think there's more that can be done with McCann on this team, and I'd rather he stay and the Seattle Kraken figure out a way to build up a roster by moving other parts. Now, whether that's realistic anymore for the Seattle Kraken, that's kind of the big question. But coming up, I want to talk a little bit about Shane Wright and his development, and we'll also close out the show talking about Nikkei Koko as well as Ty Cartier. I think they are on perhaps 2 opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to stock up and stock down for Seattle Kraken prospects who have recently made appearances in the pros. We'll talk about that coming up on today's episode. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken, as I mentioned at the top of the show, brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. When the game tips off in the MNBA, the MNBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that than FanDuel, the United States' #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. And as I mentioned earlier, right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit fanduel.com to join today. That's fanduel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the MNBA and us here at the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. Erica L. Ayala here. And we spoke about Jared McCann. Now I want to switch to Shane Wright. And I guess you could maybe put him in prospect to pros, which is what I'll talk about in the next segment. But I feel like Shane Wright is a little bit more established. And also, I just want to share with you a little bit of a funny clip that happened yesterday. It was RJ, our good friend RJ, from Emerald City Hockey, that was asking Dan Bylsma about Shane Wright. And when we look at Shane's numbers, Shane Wright definitely from the reset was able to get back into a good place. And, Shane Wright is not necessarily up there when it comes to some of the minutes per game. So if you look at Shane Wright, he's at 13 minutes, 35 seconds. That is fewer than Chandler Stevenson, who's at 19:38. That's fewer than, of course, Matty Beniers. That's at 18:34. And, Yanni Gourde, when he was kind of playing that third, fourth line center, depending on who was in the lineup, he's at 15, averaging 15:34, 15 minutes, 34 seconds. So Shane Wright averaging a little bit less time there. And so that's, I think, where RJ was coming from. Is there a conversation about potentially increasing what Shane Wright is doing? And here's what Dan Bylsma had to say. I'll explain it a little bit, set you up here. But what you're going to hear is Dan Bylsma effectively say, I don't really want to share this with you, RJ. And then there was a little bit of laughter and pause, and RJ saying, well, I'll leave if you want to tell everyone else. And then you'll hear what Dan Bylsma says in it. It's related to something that we talked about yesterday with Jordan Eberle. Said he would play 2 of the 3 games. Instead, he played 3 of the 3. That's just a little context. Here is the clip. This is Dan Bylsma talking about Shane Wright and what the plan is for not just his minutes, but his development.
Plan I don't want to include you on. I'll be quite frank, but yeah, I shared 2 out of 3 with him, and then I gotta walk it back when he plays all 3. So I think you've seen evidence of where he's grown in his game, and where he can continue to grow. And so what does that mean? It means, he leads our team in power play goals. He's now a fixture in a spot on one of those power plays. He's getting better and better and better at playing a 200-foot game and playing in the D zone, and sometimes that means taking faceoffs as well. And that's going to continue to potentially grow here.
So it's going to continue to potentially grow in the next little bit. To me, if I'm reading the tea leaves and mostly Dan Bylsma's body language there, I'm thinking, yes, the plan is to give Shane Wright a little bit more juice, or to give him a little bit more time on ice. I don't see that as a problem. You heard in that clip that Shane Wright leads in power play goals. He's got 6 power play goals for the team. He's got 11 power play points overall. I told you about the time on ice. He's at 13:35. He was at 13:32 in 8 games. That was his average time on ice per game. So he's at that average effectively. 8 games last year, 8 games the year before. He's already at 57 games. So he's at his average. And I think it's that time of the year. I don't see Shane Wright as a liability. He makes a few mistakes, sure. Who doesn't? But I think for a team that struggled on the power play, for a team that's sometimes struggled with possession and getting in front of net, Shane Wright has been able to do those things. And you heard Dan Bylsma also talk about, with some of the added responsibility also comes him him taking more face-offs. And that's an area, of course, where Shane Wright is expected to perform. His face-off percentage right now, 45.6%. Again, in 8 games, he was at 50.6% last year and 32.3% in 8 games the year prior. So he's pretty much at his average from last year, 1 percentage point off, a little, I guess, roughly 1 percentage point off. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. He's got more time in the NHL. Of course, I said this about Matty Beniers. If he's going to be a center, centers should be able to win faceoffs for us. That's been an issue with the Seattle Kraken in their short history. Now, if there's conversation about potentially moving Shane or Matty Beniers from center, I think that's a different conversation. I'd be open to it if we think they're going to be dynamic scorers, but then you got to get some centermen. And, that's a conversation perhaps for another day. We'll close out today's episode talking about Nikita Koko. I said this yesterday. I loved that Dan Bylsma used the term moxie. It's a term I freaking love as a New Yorker, as someone who loves watching a particular type of movie, a la Goodfellas, A Bronx Tale, stuff like that. So I love that he used that term, but also I love that that's how he describes Koko. So we'll hear a little bit more about Koko. I've given you his Coachella Valley stats in the past, but we'll go over those again. And then again, kind of stock up, stock down. Where's Ty Cartier in the fold? And we'll talk about that a little bit coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by one of our new friends in Trade Coffee. If you're like my mom, your mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee. She gets so tired from working with young people as an assistant principal all day and, going to the local, DD Dunkin' Donuts, for those who don't know, it doesn't hit the same as her first cup when she has it in the morning. And that's why I put her on to our new sponsor, Trade. And let me tell you, she's pretty impressed. It's hard to impress my mom, who will drink Dunkin' Donuts coffee throughout the day. And every once in a while, she likes to go a little bit more fancy, a little bit more artisanal, and also kind of hone in on her flavor profiles a little bit more. And that's what was cool with Trade. We did this I don't live in New York anymore. So over the phone, I'm just reading out the different preferences. I know what kind of coffee she likes. And so I was able to get into a range and then say, all right, from these 8, 10, 12 options, what kinds of coffee are you interested in? She likes whole bean, so she can ground her first cup at home, get the smell as she's grinding down the beans. She likes dark roasts, dark and more, maybe not bitter, but more full-bodied, like wine, maybe full-bodied flavors as compared to more light and floral or citrusy. And so it was a lot of fun to go through the quiz and all of that. So right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. That's drinktrade.com, trade, TRADE.com/LockedOnNHL for 40% off your first order, excuse me. That's drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. And hey, tell me how that first cup of Joe from Trade goes for you. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. This is the Friday episode. We'll probably have another episode, aka like a preview episode that will go live later in the day. I'll be wearing the same exact outfit, but it'll go out later in the day. We've been posting pretty successfully, actually, a little later in the day. So we'll have that preview getting ready for tomorrow's game day a little bit later. Capo Caco. We have Capo Caco and we have Nikita Koko. We're going to talk about Koko. And he got his first taste of NHL action. It was not as planned as we heard from Dan Bylsma the other day. We talked about that. But also Dan Bylsma had really great things to say about not just his first save in particular, but just about again his moxie, his swagger. And I kind of like hearing it. You may remember that Zane Begg, who stepped away for a little bit, hopefully we'll get Zane back, but Zane and I had a conversation when it was Alice Steska who came up instead of Koko. And Zane said on the program, hey, a little bit surprised because Koko seems to be the more uh, promising prospect, but we did see both of them and pretty much back to back. So, here's what Dan Bylsma had to say about Koko, which I really enjoyed, obviously. And then I'll again go over some of his stats that we saw in Coachella Valley just to give you a gauge on what he's been able to do at the AHL level.
He's got a great moxie, and he's got a great swagger to him. I think that's a big part of him being a good goalie. And that, you look at the 200 game mark as pro games as a kind of a point where we've seen a lot of goalies come into their own and be a full-time National Hockey Leaguer, and he's somewhere in the 50 game range in his career. So he shows a lot of promise. He's got a lot of great personality and swagger, and it's evident right away. And I think, he's in that progression. You never want to put a label on it's 200 games, but he's early on in that progression of developing into a good goalie.
So there you go. He's on the right track. He's got the progression, is what we're hearing from Dan Bylsma. And if we look at Nike Koko and what he's been able to do, he's got 15 wins, 4 losses in the AHL, a 2.44 save, or excuse me, goals against average, and a 909 save percentage. The Finnish goaltender, those stats, when we look at the GAA, that has him in the top 12 at 12 overall in the AHL. If we look at his wins has him in that top 11 at 11. And his overall saves, the number of saves that he has, or excuse me, the shots against that he's got. Actually, it's Steska for the Coachella Valley Firebirds seeing more at 7.47, but he's also got more games, of course, in hand. The save percentage, if we look at that for the AHL, that 909 that I mentioned is top 15. So even in, what's not an insignificant number of games, he's played 21 games. He is in the mix in the AHL, and he's still really young. So to have that taste and to have it kind of just out there in your face, I think that's going to be something that really inspires Koko. He seems like he's a guy that's got a lot of good juice, a lot of good energy. He's got moxie, which I love. And so I'm excited to see where this season takes him. Now, there is someone that I want to talk about that we haven't talked about a lot. I've mentioned it in passing, but we have seen Ty Cartier kind of fall out of favor when it comes to the Seattle Kraken. And, he's been a healthy scratch a handful of times already this season. Ty Cartier, we're less than 20 games to go in this season. He's played 49 of our games this year, and he's got 3 goals, 4 assists. He's a minus 16. And that's a far cry from what we saw last year when he came up, really able to make a difference in, in 77 games. He had 11 goals, 9 assists. 49 games this year, 3 goals, 4 assists. He was a -1 last year. Again, that -16. His time on ice last year was 11:50 per game, 11 minutes, 50 seconds per game. He's on average at 9:48 time on ice per game when he is suited up for the Seattle Kraken. He did take some faceoffs, 47.1% clip, a 23.1% clip this year. His shots are down. He's played fewer games, but shots on goal, 109 last year in those 77 games. Shots on goal, 42 for a 7.1% clip or shooting percentage. So, this was a story all about the development and all about how you can go from undrafted to a player really making a difference. That hasn't really worked out for Ty Cartier. We haven't heard a lot about him in the scrum, but I'd be curious to hear what's not quite working with Ty Cartier, because I think Ty Cartier on this roster can give you some of that physicality that often is missing, quite frankly, from the Seattle Kraken. And we're at a point in the season where, and I've said this before, but I'm okay with this team, with the coaching staff, creating lineups, creating line groupings and defensive pairs, which actually he's been switching up the D pairs. We've seen, even as of yesterday, that Vince Dunn and Brandon Montour may be playing side by side to just shake things up. I do think we're going to see some shakeups. We're at a point in the season, playoffs not looking great. So what's on the line? Again, establishing the Kraken way of playing hockey. And there's plenty of time to do that. You need the right guys to do it. If the roster is not meeting the system not meeting the roster, or anything in between with regard to Dan Bylsma and his coaching staff versus the roster that was put together for him, that's tough. What is the balancing act? When you bring in a coach, are you bringing in the coach to manage the players that you have? Or as a front office, should you set up your roster to fit into the coach's style? I think there's a little bit of give and take there, but we've kind of seen both ends of the spectrum, it feels like. So, when it comes to a player like Ty Cartier, I don't know what exactly the coaches feel is missing, but I want to see some sandpaper. Before this season is over, I want to see some sandpaper from this team. If we win or lose, I'd rather lose knowing that there was some fight in this team. And I don't mean gooning it up, just fighting for the sake of fighting. I mean playing for pride, playing for, as Jared McCann said the other day, the name on the front of your jersey. It's probably also the name that's on your paycheck, right? I mean, somewhat of a joke, but also, come on. Playing for some pride. Guys that are going to give, if they have 80%, they're giving 100% of that 80%, emptying the tank as much as humanly possible. I think Ty Cartier more often than not plays that way. I think Brandon Tanev plays that way. Jaden Schwartz plays that way. Matty Beniers can, I think his mental game on the offensive side sometimes takes him out of plays where he probably should shoot a little bit more, but he's got it. He's got the toughness defensively, and we don't lose at all, lose anything from our game, that is, when he's on the ice. And, are there other players, though, where that's not the case? I think it's hard to differentiate. We can look at certain stats and things of that nature, like Chandler Stevenson just doesn't seem to really like playing defense. And he has a 7-year contract, 7.7 or around 7 million AAV. And he's got a no trade, no movement clause. So, how are we building this team? How is the front office helping the coaching staff? But more so for me, it's just, if the ship's going down, go down with a fight. And I'm totally fine with a roster that maybe doesn't have any superstars, which we're kind of already there, right? We don't have elite level scoring comparative to the rest of the NHL. So put together the roster that's going to fight, that's going to put up a fight, that's going to battle hard. I want to see what that version of Seattle Kraken hockey looks like, because unfortunately, it's been few and far between. Maybe it's too much thinking, too much. Maybe it's not the right pairs, not being completely healthy. You can never leave that out of the equation. I mean, it's hockey. But just give us something to believe in. Something to believe in. And sometimes you really got to muck it up. You have to shake things up. You have to be willing to do what seems almost nonsensical. What's the worst that's going to happen? We don't make the playoffs. We're not going to make the playoffs anyway. What's the worst that's going to happen? We get better odds of getting a high draft pick. There's not much to lose right now other than more hockey games. And if we're going to lose hockey games, I'd rather lose with a little sandpaper, with a little P&V, with a little excitement, a little entertainment, a little bit of pride, and making it hard to play against us. We are not a layup team or an empty net team, right? I guess that's the equivalent, right? We're not a layup. We shouldn't be. And I want to see that reflected in how this team plays. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to others. And loud and proud we say, especially tomorrow on a game day, hold fast, stay true, and let's go Kraken. I'll catch you on the next episode. Peace out, everybody.